We watched the Blitz from up here, said our Nan. Oh God, here we go. My brother and me rolled our eyes and braced ourselves. The trouble with growing up in the 1970s was having to listen to old people going on and on about the war. Stood on this very spot, she said many times. It's because it's so high up, see? You get a great view right across London. Of course, then it was all barrage balloons and searchlights and waves of planes and the sky all red over in the east where the docks was on fire. It is high up, St Mary's Church, Walthamstow, one of the highest places in London after Hampstead Heath. We'd gone up to see the fireworks because it was the day before bonfire night, and every now and again a shower of green or yellow sparks would go up. But Nan was remembering much deadlier explosions from 30-odd years before, winter 1940, and the worst of the Blitz. She was working then in the Abercorn Rooms, which was a posh restaurant up by Liverpool Street. It was a good job and handy because Liverpool Street Station is only 20 minutes up the track from Walthamstow. She did the lunchtime shift, which meant she could be home for my dad at tea time. Now, you're probably thinking, hang on, all the kids was evacuated out of London during the Blitz, and you'd be right. Right at the start, they were all packed off with their gas masks and little brown paper labels pinned to their coats. But then nothing happened for ages, and loads of them came back. My dad came back from Glasgow. He was very small, very bullied and very homesick. Walter Plant, who lived up in the top flat, he never even went. He was too frightened and his mum said he was too delicate, so she didn't let him go. The other kids said he was a weed, not a plant. Alfie Greenwood nicknamed him Weedy Walter. Alfie Greenwood. He ran away to come back. The Greenwoods lived just across the road and down a bit from Manam. Alfie was evacuated to a farm somewhere and he hated it, even though the farmer was lovely and gave Alfie a sheepdog puppy and everything. But Alfie's dad was missing in a POW camp somewhere. And Alfie knew that his sick granddad and his mum and his twin baby sisters needed him, at the age of 11, to man up and come back and be the man of the house. So one morning he put the puppy, who he'd called Spitfire, in his coat pocket and hopped on the milk train and came home. So on this particular afternoon, there they all were, Alfie Greenwood and my dad and Weedy Walter and a whole bunch of other boys, all playing on the big square tombstones just beside the church porch. The rest of the graveyard is fenced off, but those two big tombstones have stood there for 200-300 years, their names and dates gradually wearing off by generations of kids playing on them. They were playing Escape. The vicar had put an absolute ban on them digging any more tunnels after an unfortunate incident with some old bones. So now they were going over the imaginary fence of their imaginary camp. And Alfie was being the camp commandant. He had an old torch he'd nicked from his granddad and he was flashing it round like a searchlight. And the puppy, Spitfire, was barking and jumping all over him like a Rottweiler in training. And just then, my Nan came along. Alfie Greenwood, you get down off there at once. She was 5 foot nothing with her shoes on, my Nan, but she was pretty scary when she was cross, and just then she was cross. You put that torch out, she shouted. Haven't you heard of the blackout? Get down here right now. And then she saw my dad, Gerald, and she hoiked him out by the ear from the crowd of little kids. Alfie, she said, you are the oldest and you are supposed to be setting a good example. Ain't you know there's a raid started? She said, now you make sure these little uns get home. And then get home yourself. Your poor mum, she said, she's got enough on her plate. So Alfie rounded up all the little kids and the dog and set off up the hill, and my Nan grabbed Walter by the ear with one hand and my dad by the ear with the other and frog marched them off down the hill home. Nan lived in the bottom of a tall house with a long, thin garden out the back. Walter and his mum, the Plants, they lived up the top, and Miss Buck lived in the middle, and they all shared an Anderson shelter, a hump-backed, corrugated iron sort of shed down the bottom of the garden, past the wash house and the lavvy and the piles of mud that was supposed to be their attempted dig for victory. It was dark by the time Nan got in, and she knew that all the others would be in the shelter already, so she shoved the two boys towards the back door. You go get in the Anderson, she said. I'll be right along in a minute. And she ducked into the kitchen to fill a thermos with some tea and to get some bread and dripping for the boys. The air was already thrumming with the sound of aeroplane engines and the shrill metallic bells of fire engines, and then it started boom, boom in the distance, the dropping of bombs. Whitechapel, Wapping, Clapton. It's coming nearer all the time. She just got the lid off the thermos when woof! That was closer. The windows shook in their brown paper tapes and all the cups and saucers rattled in the dresser. Well, she stepped out into the garden and then she saw Gerald! My dad and Weedy Walter had not gone into the shelter. They were standing next to it. They'd climbed up on a big pile of sandbags and they were staring up into the sky, open-mouthed, gazing at the searchlight beams crisscrossing and the planes weaving through them. "You get inside," she shouted, and just at that moment, whoosh! There was a huge explosion, absolutely deafening, much closer, probably just across the road this time. Everything shook, Nan's ears popped, and as she tried to see where she was going, suddenly somebody else came crashing through the hedge, grabbed the two boys and hurled them onto the floor. And just at that second, the aftershock hit, and fizz! The air was filled with grit and dust and smoke and stench, and as she clawed her way through it with her ears popping and her chest crushed with the sense of the shockwave, she saw what had happened. This huge, jagged, smoking, stinking shard of steel, red-hot shrapnel, had buried itself point down in the sandbags exactly where my dad and Weedy Walter had been standing just 2 seconds before. Meanwhile, just 3 feet away on the ground in the mud, there's a tangle of boots and shorts and legs and, well, boys, basically. Walter's mum sticks her arm out of the Anderson shelter door, grabs Walter by the seat of his shorts and hoiked him inside. And up out of the dust and the mud steps my dad and Alfie Greenwood. "What are you doing here?" said my nan. And then, "You could have been killed." And the boys are going, "Caw," because they're looking at the shrapnel. All the boys were collecting it. Nan had had enough. "Get in there," she said, and shoved the pair of them into the Anderson and climbed in after them and banged the door. She plonked them down on the plank bench. "Alfie," she said, "what are you doing here? I sent you home." "I couldn't get there," Mrs. King said. "The road's all blocked down our way. I couldn't get round the other way either by the high street. So I went along the railway embankment and climbed through your edge." "Well," she said, "it's lucky for us you did. That was a very lucky escape." All the boys were white as sheets and shaking, and Alfie was covered in dust, and his watch was broken. The face was cracked clean across, and the hands stopped at 5 to 8. Outside, the raid was still going on. The ground's shaking, the air's thrumming, and there's clattering bits of gravel coming down on the roof of the shelter every couple of seconds. "You'd better stop with us here," said Nan, "until it's over. Your poor mum will be worried sick. They'll have been in their shelter for hours." "They don't go in there any more, miss," said Alfie. "But Grandad can't stand it. He says it reminds him of the Somme. So now they go in the understairs cupboard." "Oh, well, you better stop here anyway," said the Nan. And she poured out a cup of tea from the thermos, although her hands were shaking. So were Alpha's as he took it. He didn't drink it, but he held it because it's warm, and he was freezing cold and covered in pale dust. So Alfie held the tea, and my Nan held me dad, and Mrs. Plant held Walter, and over in the corner Mrs. Buck held on to a half-empty bottle, fast asleep, mouth open, snoring. They had the Tilly lamp lit, but it was still pretty gloomy and cold in there, and difficult to keep your feet out of the puddles on the floor. Night after night after night they took that. All was tired, all was scared, tired of being scared. Must have dozed off in the end, because my Nan woke up suddenly and it was dawn. Outside the sky was grey and smoky and stinky. Everybody got out stiff and headed for the loo. When she opened the thick blackout curtains on the front living room window, she could see there was a commotion going on halfway down the road, so she went out to have a look. And halfway down the road, there was this great, huge, gaping crater where the road should have been, and a great, huge pile of bricks and rubble where a house should have been. Just one wall still standing with shreds of wallpaper and shreds of curtains flapping in the wind like the house had been turned inside out. "That's the Greenwoods' house," she said. "Oh my God, they was in there. Get 'em out, get 'em out." There's already a team of volunteers and wardens clambering over the bricks and rubble, heading for where the garden should have been to start digging for the shelter. And then suddenly Nan remembered. "They're not in there," she said. "They're not in the shelter. Dig under the stairs." She grabbed hold of a warden and shook him by the arm till she was sure he was listening to her. "They're under the stairs," she said. "Dig under the stairs." 8 hours they were digging, 8 hours of back-breaking brick shifting. It was gone tea time by the time they found the staircase, and even then they couldn't get to the door. But they knew somebody was alive in there because they could hear someone tapping, although it was getting fainter. It was nearly tea time by the time they got them out, and the sirens were going again. They had to prise the treads off the stairs and go in that way. Old Grandad Greenwood came out first, clutching a broken nose and cursing the Jerrys. And then the little twins clutching each other, and Lily Greenwood clutching them, still and sort of silent and staring. And last of all came Alfie Greenwood. They found him right down in the corner, furthest under the stairs. And he was still and white and stiff. His watch stopped. It seemed that Alfie and his watch had stopped at 5 to 8. "Well, thank God you knew where to dig, eh, Peggy?" said the warden to Nan. "We'd have been digging all day in the garden. We'd never have found them, and they wouldn't have lasted another night." Nan felt dizzy, like the night before when the shockwave hit. How could she explain to anybody that a boy had been in her garden and had saved my dad and Willie Walter from the shrapnel at the same time as being under the stairs in his own house when the same bomb fell? Just then there was a sort of whining sort of noise, and Alfie seemed to be wriggling, and out of his pocket came the little puppy Spitfire. They'd laid him on a stretcher on the rubble, and the puppy sort of climbed up onto him and started licking his face and yapping. "Poor little bleeder," said the warden. Nan never knew if he meant the dog or Alfie, because at that moment Alfie coughed up a whole load of brick dust and opened his eyes. "Blimey, he's alive!" shouted someone. "Someone go and tell his mum, quick!" "Whew, little Houdini, eh?" A few people started clapping in a tired, weary sort of way. "What a lucky escape, eh?" Years and years later, standing in the churchyard, watching the Guy Fawkes fireworks going up over Walthamstow, Nan offered no explanation at all as to how Alfie had been in 2 places at once. She didn't hold with the supernatural. She only believed in God on the strict circumstance that he was strictly C of E and didn't do any actual miracles. "He saved 6 lives that night," she said, "if you count them up." "A lot of crazy things happen in a war," said Nan. "Well, war is crazy, isn't it? And you can't argue with that."